It was a quiet afternoon, the kind where time seems to slow down, and the only sounds are the soft rustling of leaves and distant birdsong. But then something happened that would change everything. Picture this: a millionaire, a man who had it all: money, success, a life others would envy, walking alone through a peaceful cemetery. He wasn't there for the usual reasons, like paying respects to a loved one. No, this was something entirely different. He spotted her from a distance, just a silhouette at first. A young woman walking slowly through the graves, her figure bathed in the eerie light of the setting sun. There was something strange about the way she moved, almost as if she wasn't entirely of this world. The millionaire couldn't explain it, but something about her caught his attention. Perhaps it was the way she seemed so calm, so at ease, surrounded by the tombstones. Or maybe it was the way she didn't seem to belong in such a somber place. For a moment he hesitated. Why was she here? Was she grieving? Or was there something more to her presence? The curiosity gnawed at him, and soon it became something stronger. He couldn't take his eyes off her. As his footsteps grew closer, he realized he had no reason to be there, no reason to follow her. But that didn't stop him. Something about her was magnetic, pulling him forward with every step. But as he drew nearer, a sudden wave of dizziness hit him. His heart raced. He tried to steady himself, but his legs were shaking, his vision blurred. He blinked several times, trying to shake off the feeling, but it only intensified. He reached out to grip a nearby gravestone for support, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Was it a panic attack? Had something triggered his sudden weakness? And then it happened. Just as he thought he might regain control, the ground beneath him seemed to disappear. His knees buckled, and he fell hard onto the cold, unforgiving earth. Everything around him went black. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was the figure of the woman, standing perfectly still, as if she had been expecting this moment all along. When he finally awoke, he found himself lying on the same cemetery grounds, but everything felt off. The air was thick with an unsettling silence, and for a split second, he wondered if he had died. What had just happened? Why had he fainted? And more importantly, who was that woman? His mind raced with questions, but answers seemed to elude him. As he struggled to sit up, the weight of his body felt different, almost heavier, as though something invisible was pressing down on him. His head spun, and a sense of unease settled deep in his chest. But the woman, where was she now? Had she been a figment of his imagination, a trick of his mind? Or was there something else at play, something much darker than he could comprehend? As he searched the cemetery grounds, hoping to catch a glimpse of her, a strange thought crept into his mind. What if she wasn't just a girl? What if she was something more? Something supernatural, something tied to the very land he now found himself on. The millionaire had seen his fair share of strange occurrences in his life, but nothing like this. He needed answers, and he was determined to find them. But one thing was certain: his encounter with this mysterious woman had shaken him to his core. What he didn't realize was that this was just the beginning of a journey that would unravel everything he thought he knew about life, death, and the fine line between the two. As he began to stagger to his feet, still disoriented, the sound of footsteps reached his ears. But they weren't his. They were slow, deliberate, like someone was watching him, waiting. He spun around, heart pounding in his chest, expecting to see the woman once again. But there was no one there. Or so he thought. Just as he was about to turn back, he caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of his eye. Movement just behind the trees at the edge of the cemetery. A figure. Was it her, or was it something else? The millionaire's pulse quickened. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, darker, And suddenly the cemetery didn't feel like a peaceful resting place at all. It felt like a trap, and he was the one being hunted. With each step he took toward the figure, his mind screamed for him to turn back. But he couldn't. His legs carried him forward, as if some unseen force was guiding him. The closer he got, the more the air grew thick, suffocating. His breathing became shallow, his thoughts clouded by an overwhelming sense of dread. As the figure stepped into the dim light, he froze. His heart stopped. It was her. But this time, she wasn't alone. Standing next to her was another figure, tall, cloaked, and faceless. The shadows around them seemed to shift and move, like they were alive. The millionaire's breath caught in his throat. He was no longer sure if he was seeing things, or if he had stumbled upon something he couldn't explain. But one thing was for certain. The line between the living and the dead was thinner than he had ever imagined. And if he didn't make the right choice now, he might never leave the cemetery alive. But what choice did he have? The millionaire's mind raced, but his body refused to cooperate. Every instinct screamed for him to run, to flee the cemetery before whatever was unfolding before him could consume him whole. But his feet were rooted to the ground, unwilling to move, as though they were weighed down by an invisible force. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, the blood rushing in his temples, but his gaze never wavered from the two figures ahead of him. The woman, the one who had first drawn his attention, stood motionless as if she had all the time in the world, her pale face expressionless, yet somehow knowing. The cloaked figure beside her was a shadow, a mere silhouette in the dim light, but its presence was undeniably overwhelming. The figure's form was tall, unnaturally so, its cloak sweeping the ground like an endless, swirling mass of darkness. It was impossible to make out any features, but something in the way it stood suggested that it was more than just a person. It was a force, a presence, something beyond the scope of what the millionaire could comprehend. For a moment, there was only silence. The air was thick, oppressive, and it seemed as though even the wind had ceased to move. The millionaire's breath was shallow, his chest tight. He had no idea who these beings, were, or what they wanted from him, but every fiber of his being screamed that this encounter wasn't an accident. This was no mere chance meeting in a cemetery. Something had drawn him here. But why him? What was his connection to them, to this place? He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. It felt like an eternity before the woman finally moved. Her steps were slow, measured, like she was approaching a person she had known for lifetimes. She was almost too graceful, too calm. She stopped just in front of him, close enough for him to feel the chill radiating from her, but not quite close enough for him to touch her. Her eyes were dark, deep pools of mystery that seemed to pierce through him, as though she could see every thought, every fear, every secret he had ever held. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice a low, melodic whisper, but it carried a weight of finality. The words sent a chill down the millionaire's spine. He opened his mouth to reply, but again, no sound escaped. His throat felt dry, tight, as if the air around him had thickened to the point where it was hard to breathe. He wanted to speak, to demand answers, but his mind was clouded by a sense of dread. "Why me?" he finally managed to say, his voice trembling. The woman smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was knowing, as if she had anticipated his question and already had the answer. But instead of speaking, she turned slightly to look at the cloaked figure, as though seeking its permission. The figure made no movement, but its presence seemed to loom larger as the silence grew heavier. The cemetery is a place where the veil between worlds is thin, the woman continued, her eyes never leaving his. And you, of all people, were chosen to be a part of something beyond your understanding. The millionaire's mind spun. Chosen? What did that even mean? He was just a businessman who had spent most of his life chasing after wealth and success. He had no connection to this place, to whatever strange realm these figures were from. Or did he? His thoughts flashed back to something he had read in an old, forgotten book years ago, a book that had been tucked away on a dusty shelf in his private library. It spoke of spirits, of the thin line between life and death, and of the souls who wandered between both. But that was just a myth, wasn't it? He had dismissed it then. But now, as he stood there, face to face with these figures, it felt less like a myth and more like an inescapable reality. "You're in the wrong place," the woman said softly, almost pityingly. "This cemetery, these grounds, they are not meant for people like you." The millionaire's mind reeled. He had done everything right in his life, worked hard, built his empire, achieved everything he had ever dreamed of. He had been driven by ambition, by the desire for power, for more. And yet, here he was, standing in a cemetery, facing something far beyond anything he could control. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice strained, but a part of him already knew the answer. This wasn't a random encounter. The strange dizziness, the fainting, they had all been signs of something greater, something that had been waiting for him. The woman's smile faded, her expression turning serious, almost sad. "We don't want anything from you," she said softly. "This place, this cemetery, is where the souls of the forgotten rest. And soon, you will join them." The millionaire's heart pounded harder. What did she mean? What was happening? He had never believed in the supernatural, in the things people whispered about in hushed voices. Ghosts, spirits, curses. But standing here, with this woman and the cloaked figure, he couldn't deny that something was horribly, terrifyingly real. A chill crept through his body, and suddenly, the ground beneath him seemed to shift. His vision blurred again, the edges of the cemetery warping, as if reality itself was bending. The air turned cold, and he could see his breath misting in front of him. It was as though he were being pulled into another world, one that lay just beyond the veil. And the closer he got to it, the harder it became to breathe, to think, to move. "You've been marked," the woman said, her voice like a soft echo in his mind. "And now there's no going back." The cloaked figure stepped forward then, its presence towering over him. The millionaire felt a wave of terror flood over him as he tried to step back, but his legs refused to move. The cloaked figure's hand reached out, long, skeletal fingers that seemed to stretch unnaturally toward him. And then, just as the figure's cold touch was about to make contact, the world around him went black again, and he lost consciousness for the second time. When the millionaire woke up this time, it wasn't in the cemetery anymore. The ground beneath him was soft, almost like grass, but warmer, and the air smelled different, fresher. He sat up slowly, his head spinning as he tried to make sense of his surroundings. It was dark, but the moonlight was bright enough to reveal the shapes around him. He was no longer standing among the gravestones. Instead, he found himself in a vast, open field, surrounded by a mist that seemed to float just above the ground. He blinked, his heart racing. The shadows from the cemetery were gone, but the sense of unease remained, thick in the air. His body ached, like he had been asleep for far too long. But everything felt wrong. The silence was deafening, the kind of quiet that felt heavy, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Then he saw her again. The woman. She was standing at the edge of the mist, her silhouette faint but unmistakable. She looked almost like a vision, more dream than reality. Slowly, she stepped forward, her movements deliberate, measured, as if she were walking through time itself. And the cloaked figure, the one that had towered over him in the cemetery, was beside her. This time, it wasn't just a silhouette. The figure was clearer, revealing a face that was not human, not quite anything he could name. It was as though the being was stitched together from shadows, a haunting mask of nothingness. "You're here," she said softly, her voice echoing in his mind, not just his ears. The millionaire's chest tightened. "Where am I? What is this place?" "This is where lost souls find their rest," she replied, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that felt like it reached into his very soul. "And now you're one of them." He recoiled, stepping back. "No, I'm alive. I'm not. This can't be happening." But the woman shook her head, her expression unreadable. "You cross the line, the thin veil between the living and the dead. You were chosen to witness this, because your greed, your ambition, it led you here, to the point where the living cannot stay, and the dead cannot go." The millionaire's mind was in chaos. He tried to push himself to his feet, to run, but his legs gave way, and he fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the truth that was sinking in. He thought of everything he had built, his wealth, his success, the empire he had created from nothing. All of it had meant nothing. It had led him to this moment, to the inevitable realization that it was all temporary, fleeting. And now it seemed that fate had a different plan for him. The cloaked figure moved closer, its presence suffocating. The air grew colder, and for the first time, the millionaire felt his body begin to fail him. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was as though his very life force was being drained away, slowly, inch by inch. "You didn't belong in the world of the living anymore," the woman said, her voice softer now, almost sad. "You were consumed by your own hunger for power, and now you'll become part of the forgotten." "No," he whispered, struggling to breathe, to hold on to whatever reality he still could. "Please, I've made mistakes, but I can change. I can go back. Let me go back." The woman's expression softened, but there was no pity in it, only understanding. "It's too late for you, but not for everyone else. You will remember this moment, this decision, and in time, the others will see what you couldn't, what you missed. The cost of greed, the price of ambition. They will have to choose their own path, and maybe, just maybe, they'll learn from your downfall." The figure stepped forward, its hand reaching down. And in that moment, the millionaire realized what was happening. He wasn't just being taken, he was being made an example of. His life, his story, was going to be a warning for those who followed the same dangerous path. And yet, as the cold hand reached out to him, he understood that it wasn't just a punishment. It was the inevitable consequence of living a life devoid of meaning beyond wealth, beyond power. The moment the cloaked figure touched him, the world around him blurred, and his consciousness started to fade. But as his mind slipped away, he caught a glimpse of the woman's face one last time. There was no anger in her eyes, only quiet acceptance. She was not his enemy. She was simply the messenger. In an instant, he was gone, his body no longer existing in the world of the living. The field, the mist, and the figures faded into nothingness, leaving only the faint memory of a man who had once had everything and lost it all. The cemetery, once so still, now seemed to hold a secret in its silence. And as for the woman and the cloaked figure, they turned and walked away, their steps disappearing into the mist. They had done their part. The lesson had been taught. The millionaire's story was now over, but for those still in the world of the living, the real question remained: would they learn from his mistakes, or would they continue down the same path, chasing what could never last? The cemetery stood silent, waiting as the veil between life and death remained as thin as ever, and the forgotten souls continued their eternal journey. The millionaire's fate was sealed, but his story would echo in the hearts of those who still had time to change.